The autumn evening descended over the city as Judge Marcus Thompson gathered his papers from the polished mahogany desk in his chambers. At 58 years old, his face carried the distinguished lines of wisdom earned through decades of service on the federal bench. The golden rays of the setting sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the room's blue carpet. Thompson checked his watch, 7:45 p.m. He had promised his wife Sarah he would try to make it home for a late dinner. Their youngest daughter Madison was visiting from college, and family moments had become precious since she left for university. A small smile crossed his face as he thought of their traditional family dinners, filled with laughter and stories about their day. The judge methodically organized the case files he'd been reviewing. 23 years on the bench had taught him the importance of order and precision. His latest case involved a complex civil rights violation that had kept him at work late for the past week. As one of the few African-American federal judges in the circuit, he felt an added responsibility to ensure justice was served fairly and impartially. Running his hand over his Silver Street black hair, Thompson straightened his navy blue tie, a birthday gift from Madison, and slipped on his well-worn black leather jacket over his charcoal gray suit. The weight of his judicial responsibilities never felt heavier than when handling civil rights cases. His own experiences, both before and after donning the black robes, had taught him that justice wasn't always blind. The courthouse halls echoed with his footsteps as he made his way toward the parking garage. Most of the staff had left hours ago, leaving only the security guards who nodded respectfully as he passed. "Good evening, Your Honor," called out James, the elderly security guard who had worked at the courthouse almost as long as Thompson had been a judge. "Good evening, James," Thompson replied warmly. "How's that granddaughter of yours doing in her first year of law school?" James beamed with pride. "Top of her class, Your Honor. She says your example inspired her to pursue law." Thompson smiled genuinely. These were the moments that made his long hours worthwhile, knowing that his presence on the bench might inspire the next generation to believe in the possibility of justice. He had walked a long road from his childhood in a segregated neighborhood to his current position, and each step had strengthened his commitment to fairness under the law. The parking garage was mostly empty, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. Thompson's reserved parking space was located in a well-lit area near the elevator, a privilege of his position, but also a security measure for judges who often worked late hours. His black Mercedes, a practical choice for someone of his stature, sat waiting in the spot marked Honorable Judge Thompson. As he approached his car, Thompson felt the familiar weight of his briefcase, heavy with cases that would require his attention over the weekend. His mind was already drifting to home, to the smell of Sarah's cooking, to Madison's college stories, and to the comfort of his favorite armchair. After a long week of hearings and deliberations, he looked forward to these peaceful moments with his family. The garage was quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from the street above. Thompson reached for his car keys, the metal cool against his fingers. The day's tensions began to ease from his shoulders as he thought about the weekend ahead. Saturday would bring his regular golf game with fellow judges, and Sunday meant church followed by brunch with the family. Little did Thompson know that this routine evening was about to become anything but ordinary. As he prepared to open his car door, he remained unaware that two patrol officers had just entered the garage, their minds set on what they considered to be harmless entertainment. The next few minutes would test not only his patience, but also his deeply held beliefs about justice, equality, and the power of turning confrontation into education. The judge inserted his key into the car door, a familiar action accompanied by the soft click of well-maintained German engineering. As he did so, the sound of another vehicle entering the garage echoed off the concrete walls, but Thompson paid it no mind, at least not yet. Officers Brett Carson and Mike Sullivan were halfway through their evening patrol when they entered the courthouse parking garage. Both in their late 20s, they had been partners for just over a year. Carson, with his crew-cut and square jaw, drove while Sullivan, slightly shorter with close-cropped red hair, gazed out the passenger window. "Pretty quiet night," Carson said, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Their shift had been uneventful. A few traffic stops, one noise complaint, and endless paperwork. As they circled the garage's lower level, Sullivan noticed the lone figure standing by the Mercedes. "Check it out," Sullivan nudged his partner, nodding toward Judge Thompson. "Guy looks a little too comfortable around that fancy car, don't you think?" A smirk crossed his face as he spoke. Carson slowed their patrol car, studying the scene through narrowed eyes. Despite Thompson's elegant suit and professional demeanor, the officers exchanged knowing glances. Maybe we should make sure everything's in order, Carson suggested, his tone carrying a hint of anticipated amusement. You know, just doing our duty. The patrol car's engine hummed as Carson carefully maneuvered it to block Thompson's Mercedes. The positioning was deliberate, close enough to prevent the car from backing out, but not so obvious as to appear intentional at first glance. Both officers took their time stepping out of their vehicle, moving with exaggerated casualness. Sullivan leaned against their patrol car's hood, arms crossed, while Carson stood slightly ahead, positioning himself where Thompson would have to acknowledge them to reach his driver's side door. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their young faces as they waited, watching Thompson's reaction. "Evening, sir," Carson called out, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness that echoed through the garage. "Having a good night?" The question hung in the air, seemingly innocent but loaded with unspoken implications. Thompson turned slowly, his expression neutral as he assessed the situation. He'd seen this scenario play out before, though usually from the other side of his bench. The officer's body language, the strategic positioning of their vehicle, the carefully crafted tone, it all spoke volumes about their intentions. "Is there something I can help you with, officers?" Thompson asked calmly, his deep voice steady and measured. He held his briefcase in one hand, car keys in the other, standing straight but non-threatening. Sullivan pushed himself off the hood, taking a few steps forward. "Just doing our routine checks, sir. Can't be too careful these days." His hand rested casually on his belt, near his holster, a subtle gesture that wasn't lost on Thompson. "This is a secure parking garage," Thompson replied, maintaining his composure. "Reserved for courthouse personnel." He gestured toward his clearly marked parking space, the sign reading Honorable Judge Thompson, visible even in the garage's harsh lighting. Carson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, sir, anyone could park in a reserved spot. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." This was a lie, and all three men knew it, but it was the kind of lie that usually went unchallenged. The tension in the air grew thicker as other officers' footsteps echoed from somewhere in the garage. Thompson remained still, his years of judicial experience helping him maintain his calm exterior despite the familiar burn of indignation rising in his chest. "Maybe you could show us some ID," Sullivan suggested, taking another step forward. "Just to be sure everything's in order." His tone was pleasant, but his stance was intimidating, a tactic Thompson had seen described in countless testimonies in his courtroom. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Thompson. Just hours ago, he had been reviewing a case involving similar circumstances. Now here he stood, a federal judge with over 2 decades on the bench, being treated like a suspect in a garage where he had parked for the past 20 years. Carson moved to position himself between Thompson and his car door, maintaining what he probably thought was a friendly smile. "It'll just take a minute, sir. Standard procedure, you understand." The officer's hand also drifted toward his belt, mirroring his partner's stance. The garage's ventilation system hummed overhead, mixing with the distant sound of traffic and the subtle crackle of the officers' radios. In the artificial light, shadows danced across the concrete pillars, creating an almost theatrical setting for what these young officers thought would be their evening's entertainment. Neither officer realized that their fun was about to become one of the most significant learning experiences of their careers. Judge Thompson stood perfectly still, drawing from decades of experience in tense courtroom situations. He had seen this scenario play out countless times in testimony before his bench, but experiencing it firsthand brought back memories from his years before becoming a judge. The familiar knot in his stomach tightened, even as his exterior remained calm. "Officers," Thompson spoke clearly, his voice carrying the natural authority developed over years on the bench. "I am the owner of this vehicle, and as you can see, this is my assigned parking space." He gestured toward the sign bearing his name, but neither officer bothered to look. Officer Carson stepped closer, his boots making soft scraping sounds against the concrete floor. "Sir, you'd be surprised how many people make similar claims." His tone carried a hint of mockery that echoed off the garage walls. "We're just doing our job here." Sullivan circled around to the other side, creating a subtle but definite barrier between Thompson and any potential exit route. "If this is your car, you shouldn't have any problem proving it," he added, his hand still resting near his weapon. The judge noticed a young courthouse cleaning staff member appear at the garage entrance, pause upon seeing the scene, and quickly disappear back through the door. Thompson knew the woman, Maria, a kind-hearted person who often cleaned his chambers. He hoped she would alert security. "I parked in this exact spot for 20 years, Thompson explained patiently, though he could feel his heart rate increasing. "James, your night security officer, can verify my identity. Would you like me to call him?" Carson chuckled, sharing a look with his partner. "That won't be necessary, sir. We just need to see your license and registration." He emphasized the word "sir" in a way that stripped it of all respect. Thompson had heard that same tone countless times in his courtroom, usually from officers trying to justify questionable stops. The irony wasn't lost on him. How many times had he ruled on cases exactly like this? Now here he stood, experiencing firsthand what so many had testified about before him. "Very well," Thompson replied, maintaining his dignified demeanor. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket, then I'll need to access the glove compartment for the registration." He narrated his movements clearly, knowing from years of legal experience how crucial it was to telegraph every action. As Thompson slowly moved his hand toward his back pocket, both officers tensed visibly. Sullivan's fingers wrapped more firmly around his holster, while Carson shifted his weight forward, ready to move. The garage's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the scene feel even more dramatic. "Keep those movements nice and slow," Carson commanded, his voice harder now, dropping the pretense of friendliness. The echo of approaching footsteps from somewhere in the garage added to the tension, but Thompson couldn't tell if they belonged to help or more trouble. Just as Thompson extracted his wallet, a new voice boomed through the garage. "What's going on here?" James, the security guard, emerged from the stairwell, his face concerned but confident. Behind him stood Maria, cleaning staff member who had witnessed the beginning of the encounter. Carson barely glanced at the newcomers. "Official police business," he stated firmly. "Please step back." But James moved forward instead, his security badge clearly visible. "Judge Thompson, is everything all right?" he called out, his voice carrying both respect and concern. The officer's expression shifted slightly at the word "judge," but Carson pressed on. "Judge or not, we still need to verify vehicle ownership." His voice carried a slight tremor now, the first sign that he might be realizing his mistake. Thompson finally pulled out his wallet, opening it to reveal not just his driver's license, but also his federal judicial identification card. The gold badge and credentials gleamed under the garage lights, impossible to mistake for anything else. "Officers," Thompson said quietly, his voice now carrying the same tone he used to silence his courtroom, "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about what's happening here." He held out his credentials, watching as the reality of their situation slowly dawned on both young officers' faces. The garage fell silent except for the distant sound of city traffic and the steady hum of fluorescent lights. In that moment, suspended between revelation and consequence, all 5 people present knew that this evening would have far-reaching implications beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The color drained from Officer Carson's face as he stared at Judge Thompson's credentials, but pride kept him from immediately backing down. His fingers traced the edge of his badge as he tried to maintain his authority in a situation rapidly slipping from his control. "These appear to be in order, sir," Carson said stiffly, the forced politeness in his voice now genuine. "But we still need to see the vehicle registration." His partner, Sullivan, had taken 2 steps back, already understanding the gravity of their mistake. Judge Thompson kept his judicial ID visible as he moved toward his car door. "Officers, I want both of you to think very carefully about your next actions," he said, his voice carrying the same weight it did when delivering verdicts. "Every moment of this encounter will be reviewed." James, the security guard, had pulled out his phone and was quietly recording the scene. Maria stood nearby, her cleaning cart forgotten by the elevator, watching with worried eyes. The garage's security cameras hummed quietly above them, capturing everything. "Your Honor," Sullivan spoke up, finally finding his voice. "Perhaps we should." "Should what?" Officer Sullivan, Thompson interrupted, fixing him with the stern gaze that had made many lawyers rethink their arguments. Should pretend this was a routine check. Should ignore that you deliberately blocked a federal judge's car for your entertainment. Carson's radio crackled to life, making everyone jump slightly. Unit 247, what's your status at the courthouse garage? The voice belonged to their sergeant, probably alerted by now to the situation. Before Carson could respond, Thompson reached into his car and retrieved his registration. I believe your sergeant would be very interested in joining our discussion, he said, holding out the vehicle documents. In fact, I insist on it. Sullivan grabbed his own radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 247. Where? He paused, looking at his partner. We're going to need Sergeant Martinez to come to the courthouse garage. The next few minutes passed in tense silence. Carson shifted his weight from foot to foot, while Sullivan seemed fascinated by his shoes. James maintained his position, phone still recording, while Maria had begun stress-cleaning nearby surfaces with her cart supplies. Sergeant Elena Martinez arrived within minutes, her quick footsteps echoing through the garage. She took in the scene, the blocked Mercedes, her two officers looking like scolded schoolboys, and a distinguished man holding judicial credentials, and her expression darkened with understanding. Your Honor, Martinez said immediately, recognizing Judge Thompson from previous court appearances. I apologize for any inconvenience. She turned to her officers, her voice sharp. What exactly is going on here? Carson attempted to explain. We were conducting a routine vehicle check. In a secure judicial parking garage. Martinez cut him off. At a clearly marked reserved space, her voice carried the weight of future disciplinary actions. Thompson raised his hand slightly, the same gesture he used to quiet his courtroom. Sergeant Martinez, I'd like these officers in my chambers tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. We're going to have a very thorough discussion about tonight's events. Martinez nodded firmly. They'll be there, Your Honor, and I'll be accompanying them. She turned to her officers. Move your patrol car, now. As Carson and Sullivan hurried to their vehicle, Thompson turned to James and Maria. I'll need both of you to write detailed statements about what you witnessed here. They nodded. Maria still clutching her cleaning supplies like a shield. The patrol car's engine started up, and the vehicle backed away from Thompson's Mercedes. Through the windshield, both officers looked pale and shaken, the reality of their actions finally sinking in. Your Honor, Sergeant Martinez said quietly, I assure you this will be dealt with appropriately through our internal affairs process. Thompson checked his watch, nearly 8:30 p.m. now. His family dinner was long delayed, but perhaps something more important had taken its place. Sergeant, I have a different approach in mind, he replied, watching the patrol car retreat to a respectful distance. Sometimes the best lessons don't come from punishment. As Thompson finally got into his car, he caught a glimpse of the two young officers in his rearview mirror. They stood with their sergeant, probably receiving the first of many lectures to come. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, he had given them a night to think about their actions and the true meaning of justice. The following morning arrived with a heavy sense of dread for Officers Carson and Sullivan. They sat stiffly in their dress uniforms outside Judge Thompson's chambers, the courthouse hallway's wooden benches feeling more like punishment than furniture. It was 8:45 a.m., and every tick of the wall clock echoed their mounting anxiety. Sergeant Martinez stood nearby, her arms crossed, occasionally checking her watch. She hadn't said much during the drive over, but her disappointment radiated like heat. The night before had been sleepless for both officers. Carson had called his wife 3 times, worried about losing his badge, while Sullivan had spent hours researching Judge Thompson's career. Did you know he's handled over 40 police misconduct cases? Sullivan whispered to Carson, his voice barely audible in the quiet hallway. And he's known for being fair, even when officers messed up badly. Carson wiped his sweaty palms on his uniform pants. Maybe we should just resign now, he muttered. Save everyone the trouble. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by genuine fear about his future. The elevator dinged, and James, the security guard from the previous night, stepped out with Maria, the cleaning staff member. Both had been asked to attend this morning's meeting. Maria clutched her written statement, her hands trembling slightly as she nodded hello to the officers. At exactly 8:55 a.m., Judge Thompson's law clerk, Sarah Chen, opened the chamber doors. "Please come in," she said professionally, though her eyes held a mix of curiosity and disapproval. The group filed in silently, like defendants approaching their sentence. Judge Thompson's chambers were impressive, but not intimidating. Law books lined the walls, and morning sunlight streamed through tall windows. Family photos sat on his desk, showing him with his wife and children at various celebrations. A golf trophy gleamed in one corner. Thompson himself sat behind his desk, reviewing what appeared to be last night's security footage on his computer screen. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said calmly, gesturing to the chairs arranged before his desk. "Please be seated." Carson and Sullivan sank into their chairs, backs straight, hands on their knees. Sergeant Martinez took a position standing behind them, while James and Maria sat slightly to the side. The silence felt thick enough to cut with a knife. "Officers," Thompson began, closing his laptop, "I've spent most of my night thinking about our encounter." He paused, studying their faces. "But before we discuss that, I'd like to show you something." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph. "This was taken in 1985, he said, sliding it across the desk. The photo showed a younger Thompson being handcuffed by two white officers beside a luxury car. I was a prosecutor then. The officers thought it was funny to detain me outside the courthouse. They also didn't believe I owned my car." Carson and Sullivan leaned forward, their faces reddening as they studied the image. The parallel to their own actions was impossible to ignore. "Those officers were fired," Thompson continued, his voice steady. "Their supervisor wanted to make an example of them. But you know what happened? They joined another department, carried their prejudices with them, and continued their behavior until they eventually got caught again." He folded his hands on the desk. "Punishment without education changes nothing. That's why you're here this morning instead of facing an internal affairs investigation." Sergeant Martinez shifted her weight. "Your Honor, their behavior was inexcusable." "Agreed," Thompson interrupted gently. "But firing them won't address the root of the problem." He turned his attention back to the officers. "Tell me, what made you decide to have some fun with me last night?" The question hung in the air. Carson opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I. He stopped, realizing he had no acceptable answer. "That hesitation," Thompson said, pointing at Carson, "that discomfort you're feeling right now, that's the beginning of understanding. That's worth more than any punishment I could recommend." Sullivan's eyes had welled up with tears. "Sir, I don't know what to say except I'm sorry. We were wrong. Completely wrong." Thompson nodded slowly. "Being sorry is a start. But what matters now is what you're going to do with this experience." He reached for another folder on his desk. "And I have some ideas about that." The morning sun continued to brighten the room as Judge Thompson began to outline his plans for turning this incident into a catalyst for real change. Judge Thompson opened the folder on his desk, revealing several police incident reports from the past year. Each one detailed similar encounters, successful professionals being stopped, questioned, or detained with dubious justification. The officers' discomfort grew as they recognized some of the reporting officers' names, their friends and colleagues. Last year alone, our circuit reviewed 37 cases involving police stops where racial bias was alleged, Thompson explained, his voice carrying no anger, only determination. "What makes your case different is that we have an opportunity here, a chance to create real change." Sergeant Martinez stepped forward. "What are you proposing, Your Honor?" Her stern expression had softened, replaced by genuine curiosity. Thompson stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse square below. "Officer Carson, Officer Sullivan, I'm offering you a choice." He turned back to face them. "Option 1, I file a formal complaint, and we let the system take its course. Option 2, you both commit to a 6-month program I've been developing." Carson and Sullivan exchanged glances. "What kind of program, sir?" Carson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll spend 1 day each week working with community leaders who've experienced racial profiling," Thompson explained. "You'll help me create training materials based on your experience. And most importantly, you'll share your story with other officers, not as a shame tactic, but as a teaching tool. Maria, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Your Honor, may I say something?" When Thompson nodded, she continued. "Last night, when I saw what was happening, I was scared to get involved. Then I thought about my teenage son, who drives my car sometimes. It could have been him." Her words hung heavy in the room. Sullivan wiped his eyes quickly, while Carson stared at his hands, shoulders slumped. "That's exactly why this matters," Thompson said gently. "Every interaction leaves a mark, not just on the person involved, but on their family, their community, and their trust in law enforcement." James, the security guard, cleared his throat. "I've worked here for 20 years, Your Honor. Seen all kinds of things. But what you're suggesting, using this to teach rather than punish, that's something new." Thompson returned to his desk and pulled out 2 forms. "These are volunteer agreements for the program. Taking this path won't be easy. You'll face skepticism from fellow officers. You'll have to confront uncomfortable truths about yourselves and the system you work in. But you'll also have a chance to be part of the solution." Sergeant Martinez examined one of the forms. "This is unprecedented, Your Honor. The department would need to approve the schedule adjustments, the training involvement." "I've already spoken with Chief Roberts this morning," Thompson replied. "She agrees this could be a valuable pilot program." He turned to the officers. "But it only works if you're genuinely committed to change." Carson sat up straighter. "Sir, I spent all night thinking about what we did, about how easily we fell into treating you like," he struggled to finish the sentence. "Like a suspect instead of a person," Thompson completed for him. "Despite my car, my clothes, my reserved parking spot, you saw what you expected to see. The question is, are you ready to learn to see differently?" Sullivan reached for one of the forms. "I want to do this, Your Honor. Not just to save my job, but because Maria's right. It could have been her son. It could have been anyone's son or father or federal judge," Thompson added with a slight smile, the first one since the meeting began. The next 30 minutes were spent reviewing the program details. The officers would start next week, working with community organizations, attending dialogue sessions, and helping develop training scenarios based on their experience. Their story and their transformation would become part of the department's new approach to bias training. As the meeting concluded, Thompson held up the old photograph from his prosecutor days. "This stays on my desk as a reminder that change is possible, but it requires more than just punishment or policies. It requires people willing to learn from their mistakes and help others avoid making the same ones." Carson and Sullivan stood, their postures notably different from when they'd entered, less defeated, more determined. They had arrived expecting punishment but were leaving with purpose. "Remember," Thompson said as they prepared to leave, "what happened last night doesn't define you. What you do next does." 3 months after the parking garage incident, Officers Carson and Sullivan stood before a room full of police cadets at the training academy. The atmosphere was tense as Carson stepped up to the podium, his hands slightly shaking as he adjusted the microphone. "I used to think I was one of the good ones," Carson began, his voice steady despite his nerves. 3 months ago, my partner and I decided to have what we thought would be a harmless bit of fun. We didn't use racial slurs. We didn't draw our weapons. We just wanted to mess with someone who looked too comfortable in an expensive car." Sullivan stood nearby, clicking through slides showing the courthouse garage security footage. The cadets watched intently as the scene unfolded on the screen behind Carson. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing similar situations from their own experiences. "That someone turned out to be federal judge Marcus Thompson," Carson continued. "But here's the thing we've learned since then. It shouldn't have mattered who he was. What we did was wrong, period." He paused, letting those words sink in. At the back of the room, Judge Thompson sat quietly observing, accompanied by Sergeant Martinez. Over the past 3 months, both officers had undergone a remarkable transformation through the program Thompson had created. Sullivan took his turn at the podium. "We spent every Thursday for the past 12 weeks meeting with community members," he explained. "We've heard stories that mirror what we did that night. Stories from doctors, lawyers, business owners. People who did everything right, but still faced the same treatment we gave Judge Thompson." A young cadet raised her hand. "But how do we balance being cautious with not profiling?" We're taught to be alert for suspicious behavior. Carson nodded, having expected this question. Look at this footage, he said, rewinding to the beginning. What suspicious behavior do you see? A well-dressed man in a reserved parking space, holding car keys, with his name on the parking sign. We didn't see suspicious behavior, we saw what we wanted to see. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Thompson stood up and walked to the front, joining the officers. Officer Carson and Sullivan could have lost their badges that night, he said, addressing the cadets. Instead, they're helping create a new approach to police training. Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, holding up a thick binder. This is the new training manual these officers helped develop. It includes real scenarios, personal testimonies, and practical guidelines for checking our biases. Every officer in our department will go through this program. A male cadet in the front row spoke up. Sir, he addressed Judge Thompson, why did you choose this approach instead of filing complaints against them? Thompson smiled slightly. Because firing 2 officers wouldn't change the system, but 2 officers willing to learn, grow, and teach others? That creates ripples of change that reach far beyond one incident in a parking garage. Carson pulled out his own copy of the manual. In these pages, you'll find my complete statement about that night, about how it felt to realize what we'd done, about the shame, yes, but more importantly, about the learning. His voice cracked slightly. About sitting across from a teenager who described being treated the same way we treated the judge, and realizing this happens every day. Sullivan clicked to the final slide, showing a recent photo of them with community members from their Thursday sessions. This program isn't about shame or guilt, he explained. It's about understanding, about seeing people as people first, not as potential suspects. Thompson stepped to the podium. Officers Carson and Sullivan could have remained angry about being caught. They could have resigned in shame. Instead, they chose to become part of the solution. He turned to face the cadets directly. Each of you will face moments where you have to choose between having some fun and treating people with dignity. Choose wisely. As the session ended, cadets lined up to ask questions and examine the training materials. Carson and Sullivan stood with Thompson, answering queries and sharing insights from their journey. The atmosphere had transformed from tense to hopeful. Outside the classroom, Sergeant Martinez spoke quietly with Thompson. This is working better than I expected, Your Honor. Word is spreading through the department. Officers are starting to think twice before making assumptions. Thompson watched as Carson earnestly explained de-escalation techniques to a group of cadets. Sometimes, he replied, the best way to change a system is to help people understand their power to change it from within. 1 year after the parking garage incident, Judge Thompson sat in his chambers reviewing a thick folder labeled Community Impact Report. The data showed a 45% decrease in complaints about racial profiling in their district over the past 12 months. But numbers told only part of the story. On his desk lay a local newspaper with the headline, Police Training Program Goes National. Local officers' story sparks change. Next to it sat a framed photograph from last week's Community Awards ceremony, showing officers Carson and Sullivan receiving recognition for their work in transforming police training. A knock on his chamber door interrupted his reading. Come in, Thompson called out, already knowing who it would be. Carson and Sullivan entered, both looking vastly different from the shaken officers who had stood in the same room a year ago. They carried themselves with a new kind of confidence, not the arrogance of power, but the assurance of men who had found their purpose. Your Honor, Carson began, setting down a fresh report. We just finished our 100th training session. Departments from 5 different states have adopted our program. His voice carried pride, but also humility. Thompson gestured for them to sit. I saw you both on the morning news, he said, smiling. You've come a long way from that night in the garage. Sullivan nodded, his eyes moving to the old photograph still displayed on Thompson's desk, the one showing the judge's own experience with profiling years ago. Sometimes I look at rookie officers and remember how we used to think, he said quietly. How we used to act. It feels like a different lifetime. A gentle knock interrupted them as Maria, the cleaning staff member who had witnessed the original incident, entered with her teenage son, Marcus. They had been invited to today's meeting. Judge Thompson, Maria said, beaming with pride, Marcus got accepted to the police academy. He wants to join the new community outreach program that Officer Carson started. Marcus stepped forward, tall and confident in his suit. Sir, watching how you handled what happened last year, it showed me that real change is possible. I want to be part of that change. Thompson watched as Carson and Sullivan immediately engaged with Marcus, sharing advice and encouragement. The scene before him represented everything he had hoped for when he made that decision 1 year ago. Sergeant Martinez, now promoted to lieutenant, arrived next. Your Honor, the chief wants to expand the program, she announced. We're seeing results nobody expected. Officers are building real relationships in communities that used to distrust them. Complaints are down, community cooperation is up. And it all started with a bad decision in a parking garage, Carson added, shaking his head at the memory. Who would have thought? Thompson stood and walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse square below. He could see police officers chatting with citizens, their interactions noticeably more relaxed and respectful than a year ago. Sometimes, he said, turning back to the group, justice works best when we focus on transformation rather than punishment. Sullivan pulled out his phone and showed a text message. We just got invited to speak at the National Police Chiefs Conference, he said excitedly. They want us to share how this program changed not just our department, but us personally. Tell them about the ripple effect, Maria suggested. How my son went from being afraid of police officers to wanting to become one because of the changes he saw in our community. Thompson picked up the impact report again. 1 year ago, 2 officers decided to have some fun with the wrong person in a parking garage. Today, those same officers are helping reshape police training across the country. He looked at Carson and Sullivan with genuine respect. You could have resigned in shame. Instead, you chose to become agents of change. Marcus spoke up, his voice full of hope. My friends used to warn me about avoiding police officers. Now they're talking about joining the force, about being part of the solution. As the meeting concluded, Thompson watched the group leave his chambers. Carson and Sullivan deep in conversation with Marcus about the academy, Maria wiping proud tears from her eyes, Lieutenant Martinez making notes about the program's expansion. The judge picked up the old photograph from his desk, the one showing his own experience with profiling years ago. Slowly, he opened his drawer and placed it inside. Perhaps it was time for a new photo on his desk, one that showed not what had gone wrong, but what could go right when justice was tempered with wisdom and opportunity. Sometimes, he whispered to his empty chambers, the worst moments can lead to the best changes. He smiled and began preparing for another day in court, knowing that somewhere in the city, 2 officers were continuing to turn a moment of darkness into a beacon of hope.